Hello, today is Thursday, August 30th, 2018. I'm Joe Schmidt with TC2, and this is Staying Connected. On today's podcast, we are continuing with our series, Staying Ahead of the Demand for Network Cost Savings. Now, if you've been listening to these podcasts, you know that we've been revealing useful strategies to help enterprises achieve continuous network cost improvement and deliver world-class network infrastructure. I'm joined today by Tony Mangino, a project director at TC2, and Andrew Brown. Andrew's the managing partner of LB3, and he's also the chairman of TC2. The three of us are going to be talking about broadband aggregation. Specifically, we'll look at the role that broadband aggregation can play in your network sourcing strategies for the so-called Internet First and SD-WAN. Okay, guys, thanks for joining me. And Tony, let me start with you. Broadband aggregation, it isn't really new. So can you explain to our listeners why we're talking about this subject and what's going on in the market that is new?
Yeah, of course, Joe. So you're right. The concept of broadband aggregation isn't really new. Enterprise customers' use of broadband is undergoing a pretty substantial shift right now. It used to be that broadband services were used in the enterprise network as a secondary technology, like for backup to a primary MPLS connection where it was too expensive to cost justify dual MPLS connections. Sometimes it was used in a managed broadband VPN type configuration for smaller branch locations.
So presumably enterprises are using hybrid networks made possible by SD-WAN technologies, for example, and it's changing the way the companies use broadband.
Exactly right.
Okay, so Andrew, you and I did a podcast a couple of weeks ago with our colleague Mark Sheard covering SD-WAN and Internet First strategies. And one of the takeaways was that the shift toward greater use of broadband in enterprise networks was the source of real cost savings in deploying an SD-WAN solution. So how does broadband aggregation fit into that?
Hey, Joe. Well, aggregation is theoretically at least an easier, more efficient, more cost-effective way for an enterprise to purchase broadband connections across multiple locations. Traditionally simple broadband connections weren't a primary source of network connectivity. They were usually sourced locally, maybe even on a one-off basis. And were really just used to reduce access costs for a particular location or, frankly, for things that weren't that critical, like internet offload or whatever. It was pretty tactical. Typically not a lot of visibility across the network into these broadband connections from either a networking or a sourcing perspective. No comprehensive service levels, and just generally not a part of a cohesive sourcing strategy. But like Tony just mentioned, the uses of broadband in enterprise networks, mainly due to the increased use of SD-WAN, those are changing pretty dramatically and pretty quickly, and it's going to become a primary form of access in a lot of places. So it makes sense that the way customers buy broadband needs to change too.
Yeah, that's spot on, Andrew. And to that point, TC2, we're already seeing with our clients a material increase in the amount of broadband that enterprises are including in their sourcing activities. A big part of that really is looking to obtain broadband on an aggregated basis from a single supplier rather than continue that non-strategic kind of one-off procurement of these connections that you were just talking about.
So, Tony, what is an enterprise looking to get with a broadband aggregation strategy?
A few key points, Joe. First is lower supplier management overhead by, ostensibly getting one throat to choke, or at least fewer throats to choke. Cheaper unit costs on the broadband connections themselves. Comprehensive SLAs across the network. And more ubiquitous broadband coverage from the provider, even if they don't own all the facilities. Basically, what you'd expect to get from a single supplier, but as Andrew mentioned, using a broadband aggregator is theoretically more cost-effective and efficient. There are a lot of mistakes and wrong turns, though, that an enterprise can make, including not properly setting internal expectations about where the enterprise is going to end up.
Yeah, and there's still a pretty wide variation in the types of terms and pricing that you can get from the various aggregators. And you can't assume that they're all going to provide the same scope of services across the same geography at the same prices. It's still an evolving market, and the vendor offerings are changing rapidly. So enterprises need to bring a very structured approach to sourcing broadband, especially in cases where they're using an aggregator. One throat to choke is still very hard to pull off, and you're more likely to require multiple aggregators or an aggregator supplementing a traditional provider.
So this seems like a good time to ask, who are some of the providers in this space, and how does an enterprise incorporate them into their overall networking strategy?
Yeah, so Joe, there are, non-traditional providers, we'll call them, true aggregators like a GTT, Mettel, or Xperio. These guys are really trying to make inroads into the traditional telco space by rolling up multiple facility-based providers offering into a single package. These guys will do broadband, dedicated internet access, high-capacity point-to-point circuits. It's important to understand, though, that they're not all everywhere, so you'll likely need to use more than one. And while they are improving rapidly, sometimes the maturity of their sales and contracting teams, and to some degree the enterprise account support can be, how should I put this, a bit immature. A good sourcing process and some patience helps a lot, though, to get these deals in place.
And then there are the traditional providers, which we know and love.
Right. The traditional providers are effectively default aggregators, really. And even if they're not perfect, they can do a pretty good job of aggregating broadband even from other providers. Their coverage tends to be good on the access ends, and the expenditures you make stay within the existing contractual relationship you already have, which makes things easier, particularly on the leverage front. But the per circuit cost for the broadband they provide tends to be a lot higher than with one of the niche providers I mentioned earlier. So you'll pay for the privilege of staying with your traditional provider. Isn't that great?
Great. So, Tony, how about if you provide some tips on how to go about incorporating a broadband aggregator into an enterprise's overall network sourcing strategy?
For sure. First, I would say you need to understand the scope of your broadband deployment and role in a transformed hybrid WAN is going to impact supplier selection. Take into account things like geography, coverage, available speeds, service and SLAs, various contract positions, circuit performance, circuit type preferences are all going to affect who can provide your service and the terms under which that service is provided. Needless to say, cost modeling, which is something that we do here at Tech Caliber, and quantifying the opportunities and constraints gets complex quickly. So make sure you're prepared for that or get someone from the outside to help you. Finally, realize that the promise of access everywhere does not mean that aggregators are all equally strong everywhere. There are wide variations in geographic coverage and pricing.
Yeah, that's right. And I know in some instances we've seen where DIA costs from certain providers are actually higher than the corresponding speed for an MPLS connection.
Yeah, for sure. It's not common, but we've seen that, which is why you need to take a detailed look at the vendor's pricing through a structured process. Absolutely.
So, Andrew, what about from a contract and a terms perspective?
Well, the biggest problem with one throat to choke is that it can lead to buying services under terms that quickly approach the lowest common denominator available for those terms. So if the aggregator is just passing through terms from underlying providers that it is getting services from, you'll just end up with a big lousy mess of pass-through terms. That's a very dated way for aggregators to provide service. So you have to do some work to get a single set of comprehensive terms from the aggregator you've selected, including SLAs, performance-based terms, those kinds of things. And to be clear, that is not easy, but nothing helps motivate a provider in this area more than knowing there's competition for your business. So don't single source this type of transformation if you can avoid it.
Okay, thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Tony. I think this has been a very interesting discussion, and you guys have definitely given our listeners some great ideas for the best ways to go about integrating broadband aggregation into their sourcing strategies. Okay, for our next podcast in the Staying Connected series, I'll be joined by my TC2 colleagues, Teresa Knutson and Brian Carricker, who will be talking with me about deploying TEM services as part of an integrated approach to managing expenses. So please look out for messages from us providing links to the latest podcasts, or you can simply go to our websites. And finally, if you'd like to learn more about the best practices for ICT procurements, or if you'd like to discuss other ICT needs with Tony, Andrew, me, or any of our LB3 and TC2 colleagues, please give us a call or shoot us an email. And you can also stay current by checking out our websites or follow us on LinkedIn.